Right. Hey folks, it's Faz from Fazlifts. Today I want to speak about rest periods. Now, I'm just going to give you some general thoughts on rest periods. The more I coach, the more I've been around the block, the more I see how a lot of things can work. As long as you're making progress, it's all good. Tons of things can work. Whatever kind of fits your vibe, go for it. Keep it until it stops working and then move on to something else. And I think there's a lot of information out there. Like I've said this before, when I was younger, it was the opposite problem. We hardly had any information. We had one website called deepsquatter.com, which is still up. You can check it out and go to the archives. Those are the articles that's all I had. Now, apart from that, there were a few message boards, and then there was usually just the guys at the gym. And they're not always a reliable source of information. I've told this story before. There's an old guy called Ron, and he came up to me and my brother in the first year of training, and he told us not to squat all the way down. So we were doing full squats, and he said, no, you don't want to do that. He suggested that we do a half squat. And he was an old guy, but he must know what he's doing. And he said, if you do full squats, you're going to snap your back up. So we're like, oh God, we don't want to do that. So for 9 months, I did half squats, and I got up to some ridiculous poundage, 160, 180 kilos. And I thought, yeah, this sucks. My back hurts and my legs don't look any different. So the old guys don't always know what they're talking about. And that's true no matter what generation you're from. Some of the old guys are they're not a reliable source of information. Some of them are just a bit out of touch. And I think that happened with Ron. He was coming to the gym. He was involved in the gym culture, but he wasn't really working out anymore for any goal. And I think when that happens, they can lose touch. So be wary. Just because somebody's old doesn't automatically make them wise. But not picking on anyone in particular. I'm just rambling now. But anyway, I want to speak about rest periods. I wanted to speak about rest periods within the context of how they affect intensity, frequency, and volume. And guys, I encourage your discussion here. So please do write to me with your thoughts, your experiences, more your experiences. I'd like to know what you've done, what has worked for you, because that's important. Share the knowledge, right? Now, with me, I've done a wide range of things, but there has been principles in play throughout, right? And that's what I want to share today. Recently, I've been training with more sets to failure and beyond. You guys have seen my training videos. I'm on a bit of a kick with that at the moment. Old school for me. Back in the early 2000s, that is how I was taught to train, with the Dorian Yates crowd. The idea was that when you fail a set, that is the beginning of the pain. After that, we would do partials, then forced reps, then negatives. And when you couldn't even lower the bar or the weight under your own strength, then you were done. So that was that. You may end up doing 10 more reps after you actually fail. So that was the type of training I grew up on. I'm going back to that style of training now, 20 years later, and it feels good. I've also reduced my volume as a result of that. And naturally, because I've reduced my volume, I can afford to take more rest. Okay, so that's how it works. There is a knock-on effect. So if you're training very intensely, okay, then you typically will be resting a bit more time just to prepare you more for the next set. And as a result, your volume goes down. So we have this relationship where rest period affects the big three being intensity, frequency, volume. If your rest periods are long, okay, reasonably long rest periods, 3 to 5 minutes, whatever. I never take more than 3 minutes. By the third minute, I'm gagging to go, right? But I take about 2 or 3, which for me is a long time. At that stage, I am recovered and I'm good to go. Now, if I'm doing that, I better well be training very intensely, okay? Now, as a result of me training very intensely, my volume is a little bit lower than it would be, say, last year, and my frequency is a little bit lower than it was last year. And that's the relationship. It's really simple. It's not rocket science. Now, conversely, a couple of years ago, I came onto the YouTube scene, and one of the things I was discussing was this idea of just being aware of your rest periods, because I was very aware that people were resting a hell of a long time. And I wasn't really seeing the need for it when I saw their sets. So if I saw somebody's set and they sent it to me on Instagram, for example, or a new client, I saw that they were taking very extended rest periods, but there wasn't really a justification for doing so because the sets weren't that hard. And so I was pushing back against it. I was trying to encourage people to be mindful of their rest periods. Now, I got a lot of pushback on that, and that's fine. Like, I don't mind getting pushback, but people were defending their choice to take very long rest periods, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 8 minutes, because in their mind, they needed their performance to be super high for the next set. Now, that would be fine, but I didn't see the intensity. Do you see what I mean? So this is where you can go wrong with the rest periods, because if you're resting a hell of a long time, but your sets don't look that hard, then what you're doing is you're dragging down your volume and your intensity isn't that high. And at that stage, it doesn't really matter what your frequency is because you're not going to provide the stimulus to the muscle to grow. You see what I mean? So if somebody's stalled, or if somebody, let's say they've been training for 5 or 10 years, they haven't really gotten out of the intermediate stage, and they've insisting on taking long rest periods because something they've read, something reasonable that they've read, but they're not really performing hard sets. I'm going to say we've got to improve something. We've got to either be more mindful of our rest periods so that we can do a bit more volume, or we've got to try and train harder. Either's fine. See, there's a connection there. You've got to push something or moderately push everything. You've got to get to the point where you're delivering a stimulus that the muscle will recognize, which is strong enough to grow. That's the idea. And that's where rest periods come into it. So I'm not a short rest period advocate per se. I'm an advocate of delivering enough of a stimulus to the muscle to grow. Okay. Whatever you want to do, it's fine. Whatever excites you, it's all good. I think it's just a case of just be aware of your rest periods and how they affect the overall program. So long rest periods, great, but you better be pushing that intensity, because as a result, your volume is probably going to be lower than it would be if you're resting less. Okay, so you got to push something. Now, conversely, if your rest periods are low, you better be ramping that volume up. And that's the basis for some versions of my wizard routine, where there's plenty of volume across the week. And there are some controlled rest periods on certain days. Like the light day, for those of you familiar with my wizard routine, the light day actually has you doing short rest periods, 30 seconds to 60 seconds on purpose, because that is matching the higher rest periods on the other days, whereas you might rest 3 minutes or more for your basic lifts. So it's a mix of everything, that routine is, which is one of the reasons why it's so popular and effective. But anyway, I didn't want this to be a very long video, and I do want to hear your thoughts. What has worked for you? Okay, are you one of those longer rest period, got to be ready, performance orientated, very intense guys? And if so, are you training very intensely? Do you regularly take it to the house and beyond? Or conversely, are you the kind of guy who wants to push the volume a little bit higher and maybe stay within 0 to 2 RAR? And again, I've said that's a fine approach too. These are all systems within themselves. As long as you're getting the result, it's all that matters. Okay. Hopefully you found that quite interesting and maybe provide some clarification of what might seem like lots of different voices in the space saying one thing versus saying the other. Some people get very angry about things, some people get very excited, but actually there's room for a whole bunch of really good approaches within the context of bodybuilding. There is no real right or wrong answer. You've got to work hard. You've got to push something. The body has to be stimulated. It has to be challenged to grow. Now, what that particular balance of challenge is, well, it's down to your personal preference. And also, it changes year per year. It changes for me. I've been training for 25 years. Of course it changes, you know? Of course it does. Some years you prefer higher intensity work, lower volumes. Other years you prefer like slightly higher volumes, maybe keeping a rep or two in the tank, or not taking it past failure. So all of these things work. I think it's a terrible idea if you are on a platform like I am and you use that platform to be very dogmatic about these approaches, because I'm going to do all of those again and again over the next 20 years, hopefully, touch wood, right? So yeah, don't get caught up in dogma. Just make sure you're focused on what works. And if you've got something that works, great, stick with it. If you don't, take what I've said and maybe look for how that applies to what you're doing. Maybe you've tried to mix a couple of different approaches. Maybe you haven't really understood the definition of working really hard if your rest periods are really long. Maybe your rest periods are shorter and you've lowered the volume. So what have we got there? So lots of opportunity to individualize your own routines and how you approach things. And that's an important thing to remember, because I think one of the things that sells YouTube videos is dogma. Everyone likes to hear that loud, shouty person in the on the video. I'm not that guy, but there are other channels who do that. But I think sometimes they do their audience a disservice, because in the end, there are many roads to Rome, and you need to pick what jives with you. As far as I'm concerned, I'm a facilitator of your progress. Okay. Right, all the best. I'll call it there. Have a great evening, whatever you're doing, and speak to you in the next one.